Welcome to the Nerd Party.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Missing Frames. This is the podcast where we watch all the movies we should have seen by this point in our lives. I'm your host, Shawn Eastridge. I'm thrilled beyond all reason to be joined by Mr. Tony Black, his first time on the show. Welcome, Tony.
Thank you, Shawn. It's a real pleasure to be on the show talking about a film I'm deeply ashamed I have never seen before. I'm so sorry.
Your shame has brought this show great joy because this is one of the great films of all time. I'm just thrilled I found somebody who hasn't seen it, and that film is Steven Spielberg's Jaws, which was his big breakthrough, the one that paved the way for blockbusters, for Spielberg's career in general. But you have not seen this film, and I just want to know why would you do this?
What have you been doing with your life, Tony, for 37 years?
That's what I want to know.
Well, I feel like the name of the film is appropriate for, people's reaction, when I tell them, because their jaws tend to hit the floor whenever I say, I've not seen it. I've not, and they're like, what? It's up there with people who haven't seen The Godfather, or things like this. I honestly, Shawn, I don't know. I really don't know why this has never happened, because
you got a thing against sharks? Is that it?
Maybe I had a trauma with a shark when I was a child that I can't remember and I've blocked out. If my mum is listening, and of course she will be, do fill me in, Mum, if anything happened. But no, because I'm a big fan of Spielberg. I've seen pretty much most of his films. Some of them many, many times. I would say he's got about at least two movies in my top 5 films, my favourite films of all time. So in theory...
Which ones?
So it would be Duel, his first theatrical release, which was just before Jaws.
And I've never seen that.
Well, we should talk about that, because I think there is connective tissue to Jaws there.
There absolutely is.
There is. And the second one would be Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, which...
Wow!
I love. I know that film inside out, and I love Raiders as well. Don't get me wrong. I like all the Indiana Jones films, even Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, believe it or not. But
my goodness,
I even like that one. But those are two of my favourite movies of all time. I've seen them countless times, And if we had a top 10, I'm sure Jurassic Park is in there, Raiders is in there, So in theory, Spielberg is probably my favourite director.
Same.
Well, awesome. But I have this massive, blind spot here of what actually, in many ways, might be his most famous movie. I kind of think if there is a film he's done, Shawn, that is beyond iconic, it's got to be this one.
It's got to be this one. But the thing about him, what's crazy when you think about Spielberg, trying to put his career in perspective is near impossible. Yeah. Because I could 100% agree with you, and then at the same time, I'm like, well, what about Indiana Jones? What about E.T.? What about Schindler's List? The guy has made so much that has become part of the cinematic lexicon. It is so hard to pick what is his greatest film. I think I have 2 or 3 of his films in my top 10 as well. And if you were to make a list of the greatest films of all time, Spielberg would probably have, I think Spielberg, Scorsese, maybe a couple other, Bergman, maybe Kurosawa. These are a few of the select few who would have multiple entries. And even then, I think Spielberg might come out on top. But you're absolutely right. It's amazing that as your favorite filmmaker, Jaws is one of his seminal movies, and this is so exciting that I get to be a part of your first viewing of the film. I remember Jaws was a movie that, because of its very nature and it's more intense and it's kind of a horror film, and a lot of people would consider it maybe the greatest horror film of all time. I never saw it growing up. My parents would never let me watch this movie because it is pretty terrifying at points. And what happened for me the first time I saw it, I think I was maybe about, I want to say 13 or 14, and it was playing on TV, and I decided to just check it out. I don't know what inspired me, because I'd been avoiding it for so long because I'd heard all the terrible stories about people who had seen it and were scared to go in the water and all that stuff. So I think it just pulled me in. It was on TV, and it was my intention just to flip past it. But then the filmmaking and the storytelling was so strong. It grabbed me from the get-go. And there were points in the movie, I won't say which because I don't want to spoil anything, although I'm sure it's such a part of the culture in this day and age that I'm sure you know famous scenes from the movie. But there are certain points in the film where I had to turn the channel because I was so high strung and anxious about what was happening. I couldn't. I kept flipping back and forth between that and maybe some cartoon show that was way less intense. And that was my first experience with the film. I don't even think I saw it all the way through for another year, but I just fell in love immediately. And it was, it's hard to place this in his filmography if I were to rank it, but I think unquestionably it would deserve, if someone made a ranking and put Jaws at the top, I would be like, sure, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I would say this is that good. And what's even more amazing about it, from what I remember, it's been a couple years since I last watched it, it is such a confident vision. It is so immediately Spielberg at this young age. I want to say he was in his mid to late 20s when he made this, but the sheer technique on display and his handle of storytelling and his ability to direct actors and get these incredible natural performances from people, that it was so on display so early in his career. I just, growing up and as I started to appreciate the art of filmmaking more, it just became more and more impressive to me. But I don't know, since I haven't seen Duel, what is that on display in Duel? Is that stuff there? Do you get a sense that Duel feels like a Spielberg movie, or do you think it comes a little later in his career?
I would argue it probably is, but it's still sort of formative, because with Duel there were a lot of interesting facts about how it was originally a TV movie that then became based on a story by Richard Matheson, the great writer Richard Matheson, that then, once they realised the cinematic potential of it and they realised that it would be, good to put out in international markets, they made it into a feature. And that hence why it's only just over 80 minutes long. And it is essentially, from what I know about Jaws, and like you say, I have picked up things over the years and I've seen clips and, read about things and stuff like that. But it is essentially Jaws on land for many people. The premise of Duel is essentially a guy driving to a conference, driving to work through the desert, overtakes this old oil tanker that you never see the driver of this thing, but it's been driving for years. It's like an old fuel tanker. And then after doing that, the driver just pursues him in this deadly pursuit throughout the desert that becomes more and more tense. And it's just, most of it is just Dennis Weaver in a car being terrorized by this truck. There's not a great deal of dialogue in many ways. And it is just an absolute thrill ride, from start to finish. It just builds and builds and builds and builds. And Spielberg on his day, he's a master of suspense. In perhaps more of an overtly sort of popcorn, big budget Hollywood style than someone like Hitchcock was. Who was a contemporary to a point. But Hitchcock obviously was coming to the end of his career as Spielberg's was pretty much starting, but there was a slight overlap. But there isn't a filmmaker from the American New Wave who wasn't inspired by Hitchcock in some sense, really.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
And he was of that ilk. He was there with Lucas and Scorsese and Coppola and all these guys. They all came up together in the late 60s, early 70s. So that stuff is there, but I think there is a unique sort of Spielbergian style, for the simple fact as well that he is constantly, always, never sat in one particular genre. He's never just been the suspense guy who takes the template of a murderous truck or a killer shark, or and then he's repeated that ad nauseum like some directors do. He's jumped from all kinds of different. He's jumped from science fiction to adventure to drama to comedy. This is a guy who went from doing Jaws to Raiders of the Lost Ark to The Colour Purple to Always within 10 years, 15 years. I mean, that is as diverse as it comes. Yet there is always that distinctive flavour within his work that marks him out. So the long-winded answer to your question is, I think it is there in Duel, but it's formative. And I think it then from what I've heard about Jaws, it just takes everything that was great about Duel and it puts it on a boat.
It puts it in the water. I think that's fantastic. And I do know a fun story is Spielberg, when he first saw the script for Jaws and he was starting to have conversations with the producers about getting involved as a director, he said there was something, he describes that he's like, I was young and stupid, so take this as what you will. But he started to think, he's like, well, my movie Duel, my first feature is about a killer truck, quote unquote. Duel has 4 letters in its title, and Jaws has 4 letters in its title. The universe is telling me something. And he said it just he just felt like, all right, this is the right thing to do. It's the next project for me, and that's what I'm going to do. But yeah, I'm very, very excited. I'm excited because, again, I haven't watched it in a while. I'm curious to see how it holds up, and I'm very excited for you as well, just to see this big breakthrough film that is so seminal in Spielberg's career and in cinema in general. This is super exciting. So what are you feeling? You think you're going to like it?
I'm almost certain. I mean, there is, it's very rare that there's ever a Spielberg film that I watch that I don't enjoy on some level. They are seldom. It's either that I love them to pieces or I'm lukewarm on them. Say something like Minority Report, which I think is fine. It's okay. I don't love it, like some of his others. So I think, given everything, and to be honest, I'm one of these people, you get some people who, when something's hyped up massively, they almost want to dislike it, or they want to go into it with a, I find that so often with Christopher Nolan's work. There's such a group of people who, they're actively looking for things to tear down with him because there is such hype around his movies. I've never been that kind of person. If somebody tells me something's awesome and keeps telling me it's awesome, you've got to do a lot of work to convince me otherwise, because I tend to think that, generally, most people are right. If a group of people say something's awesome, it probably is. Yeah, it probably is. And whereas, some people try and feel the opposite. Oh, all those people are saying it's awesome. It can't be. So no, I am very confident based on that, based on the fact that it's Spielberg, based on it's such a legendary film. And I mean, I'm in a way, I'm glad that it's taken me this long, because I feel like sometimes, and I'm sure you've discussed this on this podcast before, but sometimes it feels like people think that cinema's a sprint, and that you've got to do it all. You've got to get all the greats done, in quickly. And I'm a bit like, well, no, let's save some. Let's save some. I quite honestly, I want to be 70 years old and I've not seen Citizen Kane, or something like that. Do you know what I mean? I kind of want to space it out, because then if you've seen everything that's amazing and great, and yeah, they still do make great movies now. I'm not one of those people who thinks that modern cinema's terrible. In fact, I think it's really good on the whole. I think you do get masterpieces made. But I love the idea of seeing something when I'm older that everyone has loved for years. So I think this is I don't know if you feel the same way, because this is your bread and butter, discovering through other people their films they haven't seen. But do you feel that? Do you have films like that you're almost, if not intentionally, but you're almost saving for a later time?
All the time. There's so many that part of the joy of this podcast is it finally gives me an excuse. There are movies I own that I've owned for years that I still haven't watched. One of which, Dirty Harry, I owned that for so long, and then I finally watched it with Brad Gullickson, who is a wonderful dear friend of mine and hosts the ItModcast and Rest in Pictures podcast. And he it's one of his favorite movies, and I said, you know what, I picked this up years ago and I've never seen it, and I thought it was fantastic. And I am always on the lookout for something that I should have seen, or that I have just for whatever reason never gotten around to seeing. I'm not even joking. There are movies I have that are unopened that I bought thinking I should watch this someday. So it's great to use this podcast as an excuse to do that. But I love that perspective. I love that philosophy of, you know what, it's okay. And I think sometimes what happens is with a film like Jaws, which is a film I've kind of grown up with, You know what? A better example would actually be E.T. E.T. is a film I grew up with as a kid and kind of was like, yeah, E.T., that's fine. And then I found as I got older, E.T. went from being like a fine kids movie to being, for me, my personal favorite Spielberg film. And it was incredible as I grew up and as I started to delve into the art form of film and really appreciating what makes great cinema. That to me is part of the joy of it, is when you can take something like Jaws that has been a classic for so long, and as you have become more of a person who is obsessed with the little details and exploring the techniques and exploring just the filmmaking behind the great product that exists, you can almost appreciate it more as you go later in life. Sometimes I think the danger is overhyping something, but it's with a great movie, you can't overhype a great movie. It is great regardless of where you end up falling on the spectrum. Tony, the last question I'm going to ask you is, what is this movie about? What do you know about this movie for certain? And I'm very curious to compare this to what the actual review is.
I'm trying to think.
There's a shark in it?
Yeah. Do I give a really flippant answer, or do I try and properly answer the question? No, my instinct is that it's about obsession. My instinct is that there will be shades of Melville. There will be shades of Moby Dick. There will be shades of an intense psychological battle going on. That the shark will represent something more than just a shark, because that's always the case. In Unpicking Duel. There are so many ways to read that truck and read what that means and read how it's, about the disempowerment of the American man, the American male, and, all these things. So I think there will be lots of themes and ideas rippling under the surface. And I'd say that. And I think I'll just be waiting for that iconic John Williams refrain as well,
yes,
for that to kick in. That's when it'll feel like, oh, I'm watching something special here now.
I'm very, very excited to see what you think. So I'd say, without further delay, let's get to it and watch Jaws. We'll just dive right in.
Excellent.
No pun intended.
Well done. Yeah, good stuff. Save it for the podcast, Shawn. It's good stuff. Save it.
Now available to own on video cassette.
And we're back. Tony, what did you think of Jaws?
Rubbish. Hated it. No,
absolute rubbish.
It was awful. No, it was great. Of course it was great. Of course it was going to be great.
Did you really? We already talked about it in the first part, but was there any doubt?
No. No. I mean, I would have been really astonished had I come back from this and gone, I have some problems with this. No, I can see why people love this film. Absolutely.
Watching it again for the first time in years, it was just everything works. Everything works. I was so I've seen this movie so many times, but I don't know what it is. It's just every single time I'm so engaged and I'm so enraptured with the film. I love everything about it, and it feels like you can never see a film for the first time again. But every time I watch Jaws, I always feel that same sense of thrill and joy I got from the first time I watched it, which is just, that doesn't always happen even with the great movies. Sometimes the appeal goes away, but I don't know, this one, I just find every single thing about it. And this time around, I was just even more impressed with Spielberg as a filmmaker, especially when you know how much of a struggle it was to make the movie. Literally everything that could have gone wrong went wrong, and yet somehow everything came together to result in what we have now. And it's just incredible.
Isn't that quite often the case with a lot of great cinema?
I know, right? Like Star Wars just a couple years later.
Yeah. It seems to happen almost in spite of everything that goes on in how they film it. They come out with a great product. That adversity, I think, sometimes in a weird way can help. It's not always the case. Sometimes films are a terrible experience and they end up really, they don't come out well. Yeah, I mean, a good example of that a few years after this is probably Star Trek The Motion Picture, which is a film I really do like, but the production of that wasn't a great time and it didn't turn out brilliantly. So, but with Jaws, I think what really impresses and stands out is, firstly, that script is so good.
It really is.
It's so good. And it reminded me in a way, even though they are two very different films, although they do have a connective thread in Spielberg, it reminded me in that sense of Back to the Future, which is one of the greatest screenplays ever in cinema history, if not the greatest screenplay. And it has a similar sort of sense to it in that, like you say, everything seems to work. Everything seems to come together. The characters are so richly drawn and well observed, and they both fit archetypes, and yet they go beyond them, partly because of the casting, which I think is pretty note perfect as well. And it manages to do that trick that many films can't quite manage, in that it combines just a really well observed and well structured story with, a really skilled direction. Spielberg, you mentioned it at the top. Spielberg was 26 when he made this film. 26, 27.
It's insane.
I don't know what you were doing when you were 26, Shawn, but I wasn't creating this.
I think I was making movies maybe about as good as Jaws 3.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Maybe.
But this, it really is, for all those aspects, a pretty sterling achievement, especially for someone, and this being their only third movie, and also the first time they've really had to marshal something on this scale with this amount of ambition.
And it was really a trial by fire. Spielberg says he still wakes up with it just covered in sweat because he's had nightmares about this film's production, because he's like, I love the movie, I didn't love shooting it. And it's just from the start, just to have this be his kind of the film that made him, as this incredible struggle to get it filmed, to make it happen, and every single thing that could possibly go wrong did go wrong, but he pulled it all together. And I think just watching and remembering, I just seeing early Spielberg and seeing him adapt to certain things, like you get the vibe. I love something that Spielberg does so well and has been adopted by so many different filmmakers, is just those little human qualities, little human beats that are improvised or mistakes, but he leaves them in the movie. Like the moment when Chief Brody he's going to paint the signs, and he's in the shop, he grabs a paintbrush and the whole thing falls down on him. All the paintbrushes just fall off. You get the feeling like that really, like, it wasn't like, oh yeah, knock the thing over. It just happened. And Spielberg's like, no. Let's keep that. That's great. Yeah. And I think that's what really helps his movies rise above. And I think Jaws in particular is such an example of that, because like you said, we have three very distinctive, well-drawn characters. We have the main trio. Everyone is well-drawn. The supporting cast, Brody's wife, the mayor, everyone has their own little quirks, and they have their own traits. But the main trio itself is so defined, and their chemistry is so strong. The cast is so strong that you are just so immediately, you love all of them immediately. Even Quint, who just comes, I love his debut in the movie.
It's a great moment.
It's great. It's a great moment. What a Robert Shaw coming right in with the speech of you'll get the head, the tail, the whole damn thing. Just amazing. And it's all, for the most part, this is something else I noticed watching. I was like, I really want to pay attention to Spielberg's technique, but he lets things play out in these master shots. He doesn't do a lot of things play out in single takes, which has, in this day and age with a movie like 1917, become almost a gimmick in a way. And that's a movie I haven't seen, so I can't speak to whether or not it works for that movie personally. But I know some people were like, oh, it's such a gimmick. And you feel these days that technique is used as a gimmick. Here, Spielberg employs it as a storytelling as a means to most effectively tell the story. And the way he stages it is so effective, and it works so well. But just thinking of that shot, just kind of as we dolly into Quint, and he's talking, and you're just so involved in that in the storytelling. But I love these characters so much. But I mean, were you expecting to really embrace the characters, or really like, because I know we talked a little bit about, like, you know, there is kind of a sense of Captain Ahab with Quint, but for the most part, you know, Brody and Hooper are kind of on the outside of that. They have their own stories and their own unique obsessions. Brody, obviously, this is kind of his white whale, but not in the same way it is for Quint. So how did the movie upend your expectations in a way?
I don't think I necessarily expected quite those three particularly well-drawn archetypes, in that you have the everyman, which is Brody, which is essentially, and this is where, and I'm sorry to keep labouring this point, Sean, but this is where I see such similarities with Duel, because both of those films have an everyman at the very centre of it. You know, in Duel, the character of David Mann, played by Dennis Weaver, he's just a corporate office guy who ends up on a similar journey to Brody in some sense, in that by the end, they are both these men who are completely, in many ways, out of their depth, fighting against an inhuman monster which is coming to get them. And, you know, and the very climax of Jaws has so much in common with Duel. You know, I know you haven't seen Duel yet, Sean, so when you watch that film, you will see the similarities, you know, which are really apparent. Sure. And it's in a good way, though, not in a rip-off way, more in the way that Spielberg is almost, even unconsciously, taking a lot of these tropes that he was playing with in Duel and maxing them up for Jaws.
Well, fun little fact. I don't know if you noticed, and this is something I don't think anyone would notice unless they'd already heard about it. But Spielberg, so the moment at the end, spoilers for anyone who hasn't seen Jaws, sorry. But at the end of Jaws, when the shark has exploded and the body's sinking to the bottom, there's a sound effect that he uses. It's a sound effect of a dinosaur from like an old, like, black and white stop motion animation film, I believe. And it's the same sound effect he used for when the truck goes over the cliff in Duel. Yeah. He used the exact same clip as a way to reference Duel, which I thought was
very
so cool.
Good. I didn't actually know that. That's really good. That is, and I mean, knowing that about what happens to the truck won't ruin that film for you at all. Trust me. Okay, it really won't. Okay,
I guess we're spoiling Jaws and Duel. Sorry.
Well, yeah, right. I know. You know, I pretty much knew that Jaws would be destroyed at the end of this film. It didn't ruin the experience, and that's a testament to these films. But I think, so you've got Brody, you've got this everyman, but then you have him with, you know, Hooper, who is this he's the scientist. He's the one who comes in, and he's the one with the knowledge. He's the one with the scientific knowledge. He's the one who you know, he's the one coming in saying, well, it's not that shark, you know, it's much bigger, you know, you've got to go and get evidence and that kind of thing. And then you have, to make up this triumvirate, you have Quint, who is the old sea dog. He's not the scientist, but he's also not the everyman. He's lived, he's had experience, he's been out there on the ocean, he's got stories, he sings shanties, he is grizzled, you know. And you put these three together, and they are three brilliant parts of a triangle, because they all represent different aspects of the same masculine figure who is facing this beast of nature. And they're three parts of this triangle, and I think it just works so well. And I think, for me, the reason that I wasn't in a way surprised, I didn't necessarily expect it to work that well, but the reason I wasn't surprised is that I think Jaws, you know, a lot has been said about how Jaws revolutionized the Hollywood system, you know, and it truly began the transformation, which Star Wars really then kicks into gear 2 years later, from the new wave American cinema, which began in the late 60s with, you know, the edgy affair of Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate, and allows it to bloom into the 80s and the blockbuster and, you know, the Star Wars and the Star Treks and Indiana Jones and all these things, of which Spielberg was obviously very connected himself. But this really does feel like a crossover point, a bridge between those kind of new wave movies, which were all about characterization and had some edge and some grit, and you felt like they were about more than just, you know, a high concept, but it also blends it with the very high concept idea. And Jaws is about as high concept as you can get, you know, if you have a strapline. Killer whale terrorizes town community, and it fuses that with like you say, that modernized sort of almost urban Moby Dick-esque kind of, feel. And it brews all these together in a way which makes it feel like a transformative point for American cinema, because it balances both of these so well. And I think that is really remarkable to see.
It does, and it's, like you said, it's the pessimism of the early 70s blended with the crowd-pleasing, like, get up out of your chair and cheer. Yeah. Like, that became the later 70s, and would kind of be the thing that drove a lot of the biggest hits of the next couple decades, of the next year, because it's still, I mean, the things that happen with Jaws, the ripple effect, again, no pun intended, the ripple effect of Jaws is still felt in the MCU or any big blockbuster you're watching today. That sense of because Jaws is a pretty disturbing movie. I mean, it is essentially a horror movie, but there's also this rollicking sense of fun and adventure. It's brutal at times, but not so brutal that you can't walk away enjoying it. Like a 12-year-old, or even like a 10-year-old could watch this movie. There is some points where it's like, oh, maybe cover your eyes. But for the most part, the generation gap isn't so far apart. I think this could be enjoyed on the same level by multiple different age groups or demographics or whatever, because the themes of it, the sense of fun, and the overall optimism is so enjoyable. Like like you said, how many movies from the late 60s, early 70s would have ended with the shark killing everybody and the boat sinking and nobody's happy? This movie ends with one of the most absurd finales ever, where a guy blows up a shark by shooting an oxygen tank, and it is one of the greatest endings in history, in cinema history. So it is almost the sense of that moment, the ridiculousness of that moment, and the absurd crowd-pleasing nature of that moment signals the end. The shark exploding signals kind of the end of that cynicism in a way.
Yeah, and that's a great way to frame it, actually, because there is a satirical cynicism to this, I feel, in that, the very idea of what, the first half of the movie, because it's almost, in a way, it is a movie of two halves. The first half of the movie is the town being terrorized by this shark and them starting to understand what it is and, try and combat the town forces who are, trying to underplay it or downplay it and these kind of things. Then the last hour is pretty much the three of them on the boat on their mission to take down the Jaws. I think the first half of the movie is very much trying to make the point that, Amity and the townsfolk are quite, in many ways, quite greedy, quite ignorant. They are typifying that kind of post-60s sort of American prosperity where they feel like this can't happen. They can go out in the water. Nothing's gonna. And then when that is destroyed, when this monster comes to basically rip them apart, in, like you're saying, quite a horrific fashion. The whole basis of the original investigation is based on young kids essentially getting slaughtered. You've got the teenagers sort of on the beach getting high and that kind of thing. They're almost like a throwback to the late 60s, and then the girl gets eaten alive and she's just in a little box by the end, in little bits. Yep. And then you've got the little boy, who gets killed, who gets eaten up. And it feels to me like at the beginning the film is very much making a comment on, upending these kind of ideas. But the difference with the end is that, like you say, the end has a beat of optimism in that they destroy the monster and the two of them swim off with a little bit of a chummy thing going on.
Hooper surviving is another moment that I feel like in a lesser movie you would roll your eyes and be like, oh, come on. But in this movie, because of, I think, Spielberg has done such a brilliant job setting up just how harrowing and horrifying the situation is, that when you get that moment where he's alive, yes, and you love Richard Dreyfuss so much in the role that it's just you don't care. Like, you don't care that it's like maybe it doesn't make sense. I don't care. I'm so happy they've been through so much. I want them to live, and Spielberg was smart enough to capitalize on that and put it in the movie. But I want to talk a little bit about the opening scene, just because again, we talk about the ending being one of the greatest endings of all time. Talk about one of the greatest opening scenes of all time. How utterly terrifying and disturbing is this opening?
Yeah.
This woman being dragged around screaming. It's horrifying. Yeah. And she's not even an actress. She's a stunt woman. So the fact that she was able to pull that off, and it gives me shivers just thinking about it, but it's so effectively staged. But how did you feel? I mean, you had to have known about this opening, like the whole, like, come on in the water, that's in everything. But what was it like watching that for the first time?
I sort of did and I sort of didn't. While now you say that, mate, I have heard that before, and I've seen, like, all kinds of spoofs or pastiche or versions of it, that have echoed down. But I think I don't know if I was watching it with a conscious sort of, oh yeah, this is that moment. It was more that it was very well executed because it sets the scene for what's to come. It's this quite, picture. I mean, Amity's quite a beautiful town. It's quite a beautiful place in this really quite picturesque little corner of, I don't know where is Amity exactly in the US?
I think they said Martha's Vineyard is where they shot it.
Right. Okay. So is that New England kind of way, or is that further?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Looking it up right now.
Well, it looks beautiful.
Yeah, it's in Massachusetts.
Massachusetts. Okay. It looks really nice. It's a beautiful summer. It's in the run up to the 4th of July, and having this girl just be massacred, at dusk, it does put a chill down your spine, and I think. And this was something I expected, but I was in a way surprised at how well it was put through the whole film. The amount you don't see the shark, I think, remains so good, so well thought out and well executed, because it is that classic, movie monster and the classic idea of the scary, creature, monster, whatever it might be, from a million horror films that are out there. It's what you don't see that is scarier. And Jaws,
completely agree. Yeah,
and Jaws you do see Jaws obviously come the end, but by then the film is very much like Alien would do in 4 years' time after this. The film earns that moment in a big way because it spends a lot of the film with either just the fin or subverting your expectations or having these horrific deaths happen without seeing the cause of them, like that young girl at the start. And I think Jaws must be, Sean, you might know this, but you must be the first film to really pull this off in that way.
I think you're right. I can't think of an example prior to this. There were a lot of great horror films, and I'm thinking of The Exorcist first and foremost in 1973, that did a really good job of slow building and setting up the world and creating the reality around its characters and the reality of its setting before easing you into the more supernatural and the weirder and the more mystical stuff. Jaws does a similar thing, and I can't think of a lot of examples prior to this, because a lot of why the shark is not shown is because they kept having so many issues with the shark. Technical issues. They couldn't show the shark because it never worked, but it ended up being such a strength. It speaks to your point about sometimes these limitations end up enriching the film in ways you could never expect, because if Spielberg said it best. He was talking about you could have had the shark come out in the opening scene and just, it jumps out and grabs the woman and pulls her down. And then it's like this shocking opening scene, but it's not nearly as effective when you don't see what's happening. He kind of related it to, we all have this primal fear of what we don't understand or what we can't see. And the second you show this monster that's almost disconnected from, chances are, and hopefully this remains the case for anyone listening and for you and I, we haven't been in the water with a shark. We will hopefully not know what it's like to be attacked by a shark, but we do know what it's like to be out in the water and having that moment of like, I don't know what's out here with me. What is out here? So it was very important for Spielberg to turn that limitation into a strength and use that fear of the unknown to really fuel the audience's fear. And I think you're right. I think you see it again used extremely effectively in Alien. I think that's why Alien and Jaws are so terrifying. When I was talking about the moments when I first saw this movie on cable television that I had to turn the channel, It was the moments when the camera is underwater and it's silent. There's no music.
Yeah.
It's just people swimming, and it's just the sounds of. I just knew something bad was going to happen, and I couldn't watch it. But that was another brilliant thing about Spielberg. After that horrible scene where the woman is pulled under, it's just silent, and you just have the sounds of the ocean and the buoy, and everything is just kind of. The use of silence in this film is so fantastic. And again, Ridley Scott did an amazing job with his team in Alien, implementing the same concepts, the same idea of like, you never know when it's going to appear. And it makes it so effective. That moment where the guy gets pulled under, he gets his leg bitten off, but when he gets pulled under and you see the shark kind of spinning underneath him, and you're like, oh my God, it still gets me every time I watch it.
Yeah.
And then one of the best, again, this movie has so many of my favorite moments in any films, but you know, the line where Brody is just like, yeah, come down here and chomp some of this and the shark pops up. It's just like, what? It always gets me. I always crack up because it's so perfect. It's so well done.
You talking about the minimalism of the sound, that was definitely something that surprised me, because obviously everybody knows about John Williams' famous score here, as we previously mentioned before, it's that, that dun, 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 dun. That is one of the most legendary movie moments of cinema in terms of a score ever. But his score is probably among the most minimal scores John Williams, I think, has ever put on a film. You compare this to most of his other Spielberg films and the Star Wars films. I mean, they are draped with his amazing music, and this does have that, but it's far more minimal than I expected. More minimal than, to mention Alien again, more minimal than Jerry Goldsmith's equally masterpiece score for that film, which does seem to be there in more places than in Jaws. So I was really surprised by that. But you're right, it adds to the sense of dread that is all the way through this film. I was watching it, as you know, with my wife, and she's never seen it either. Did she enjoy it? She did. She really liked it, and she made the point that, in the beach scene, I think that was it which scene? I think it might have been the scene where it's the two boys who pretend to be a shark with the fin, and then Brody's son is in danger in the pond. But in that scene, because the lack of music, she says, well, what's scarier here is the fairground music in the background, because it all seems like it's fun and it's nice and they're having a good time, but you've just got that constant fear of, oh my God, something terrible is going to happen to these people. Something terrible is going to come out of the water at any minute. And that's a real skill to pull that off.
It's a subtle clue, too. John Williams, they only employ the score when the shark is around. So it's also a clue that the shark is not really there. It's just the fin. It's the kids pretending to be the shark. And the score never appears. And then when you go over to the pond, all of a sudden you hear the song starts to pick up. And speaking of that theme, it is so iconic and minimalistic. The first time John Williams played, he's like, okay, Steven, here is the theme of Jaws, and he goes to the piano and goes dun 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 dun, and he stops and he's like, "What do you think?" And Spielberg's like, "That's very funny, but what's the actual thing?" That's a true story. Spielberg was like, "You're kidding, right?" And Williams goes, "No," and Spielberg goes, "Play it again," and he plays it a few times for him, and finally Spielberg was like, "Huh, yeah." This is it. It's just so fun. We would never expect that because it's Jaws. It's the theme of Jaws. But like, can you imagine just hearing that, being Steven Spielberg and hiring this guy that, I mean, they'd worked on Sugarland Express together and they had a great rapport and they loved working together. But can you imagine just like, this film is you feel like this film's a disaster. Everything's going wrong. And then your composer comes in with that theme. Like, all right, I came up with this. I worked all night thinking about what it's just, I think that's so funny. But it is so, it's so effective. Like you said, I think Spielberg and Williams later in their careers tend to rely on certain tropes. And in some ways in trying to hit the nail on the head of whatever point they're trying to make, they just hit it too hard, and you hit the emotions a little too hard. Sometimes Spielberg gets a little too sentimental and Williams can get really bombastic, but this film finds both of them in top form, just being so efficient with their scores. And another one of my favorite, the Jaws theme obviously gets a lot of play, but I love the heroic themes that make their appearance in the second half of the film. Again, the trend from kind of pessimism and horror to optimistic adventure, which is still harrowing and at times very intense, but the sense of like the shot where you get the three of them in the frame, they're chasing after the shark, and the heroic music swells is among, again, one of my favorite moments in any Spielberg movie, in any movie really. But I do love that, and I love watching it and being reminded of like, God, these guys are so good. You forget it sometimes. You take it for granted. And to see them both kind of, it's as much Williams' big breakthrough as it was Spielberg's.
Well, I was going to say that because it is worth remembering that, yes, they've worked together before, but this was the film that really started to put John Williams on the map. And then Star Wars happens, which explodes his whole career, outwards. So really, even though they'd worked together before, the Sugarland Express isn't one of those John Williams scores that everybody remembers and everybody talks about, whereas Jaws is. So in some ways, Spielberg was taking a chance on this in terms of what Williams was suggesting. But it's inspired. But it is absolutely inspired. It is so simple and so brilliantly clever and works so well, to the same degree that, he then did for so many films afterwards, the Superman theme, the Indiana Jones themes, which are so simple, but they capture the essence of what the film is about in a way that is so unparalleled. And I know this isn't a movie music podcast, so I won't keep going on about this. But key.
When you talk about a movie like Jaws, you have to talk about the score. I mean, Spielberg says this about all of his films, because Williams, I believe, has scored every one of them. But he basically said John Williams' score is responsible for half this movie's success. Without the score, the movie would not have been nearly as successful. And you kind of feel like, oh, come on, you're cutting yourself short. And at the same time, can you imagine the movie without that score? Like, you can't. It's the same with Star Wars, Indiana Jones. Like, I mean, Williams is just such a key component. And Spielberg is so great at just bringing out the best in everyone, every crew member, every actor, every part of his production. He just empowers them to do the best they can. It's interesting. I mean, you're right. It was a complete risk to say, like, yeah, that's going to be the theme of Jaws, but he recognized what their partnership, they were able to recognize that. And it's a crucial part of what makes this movie so successful.
It is.
And what else, I think in terms of biggest surprises or moments that you weren't expecting, was there anything that really, really stood out where you were like, wow, I did not think we were going to go there, or pleasantly surprised you?
I think I was very surprised by Mayor Vaughan's jacket with the anchors on it. I noticed it further into the film than I should have done, and I went to my wife, what's going on with his jacket? She went, have you only just noticed this? I was like, yes. I was like, that jacket is crazy.
I want to know. I know he's in the sequel, which I've put off watching the sequels for far too long because I don't want to watch them really. But I know he's in the first sequel, and I can only hope that jacket returns.
Yeah. I please. It's worth watching those films alone just to see if that jacket's in them. But no, I think. Realistically, I don't know if anything really shocked me necessarily in terms of, that it was really out of step with what I thought the film would be on first thought. I think it was an affirmation really of what I had heard and what I was expecting. I think, if anything, I think that the points of horror sort of took me by surprise, because I knew that it was considered a horror film, but on the one hand, like we've talked about, it's straddling multiple genres. So there were a couple of particular points. You mentioned the guy getting his leg bitten off, where you just go, oh, and you squirm and that kind of thing. And I think in that sense, I was a little bit surprised at how bloody the film was at times, and how much it doesn't shy away from, even though it is showing the monster off camera and it is suggesting a lot of stuff, there are points where Spielberg will hit you with something, and it sort of underscores just how deadly and terrifying, and in many ways almost Lovecraftian this beast is, because that's the other thing. it does have, and that's why Quint is such a crucial character to this, because there is a level of the sort of sea monster, Kraken-esque legend around the idea of this great white. You know, when you see that tiger shark that the townsfolk find, and they think they've done
what?
Yeah. What? Yeah. And that in itself is fairly big, and you think, oh, well, I wouldn't want to be tussling with that. But then, the idea of Jaws is that it is this creature that is just almost unfathomably huge and powerful and deadly, and completely alien to these waters and to where, and you never really know where it's come from, why it's there, and it's more of a symbol of something than a character in itself in many ways, and that's perfect. That's just as it should be for me. I think he's representing an encroachment on normality. It is representing this completely alien, monstrous creature that comes and upends what you expect your existence to be. And I think that's what's great about the shark itself. And I think that was more profound than I expected, maybe.
Well, it's funny you bring that up, because right now, I mean, we're dealing with this whole coronavirus thing. How timely is it that we watch this movie every time the mayor is on screen saying, no, everything's fine, the beaches are open? I'm just like, oh my God. But how, I wonder if anyone out there is rewatching Jaws and suddenly discovering the parallels to what's happening in this
I've started thinking of the footage of the beaches in Florida and the beaches in Australia as well, in Bondi Beach, which is full of people, and me just at the TV going, get out, go home, what are you doing?
Shark.
Yeah. In this case, it's virus. But
I love. Well, you bring up the moments of violence, because there are some. I mean, the movie's rated PG, which is so funny to me. I mean, the movie even now feels that feels way too tame a rating. I know sometimes a movie could be rated R, and then years later, everyone's like, "Why is that rated R? It's really not that bad." This is a movie that feels like maybe we should have punched it up to R just a little bit. But I think one of the greatest moments. I keep using that phrase because every one of these great moments is one of the great moments in cinema. But one of the most effectively horrifying scenes in the film is Quint's story about the Indianapolis. This is one that I'm curious to get your thoughts on, because I was talking with my father-in-law, and he was saying, and I found myself agreeing with him. He was like, the first time I saw Jaws, I was just so on the edge of my seat and so just like terrified and engaged with the film that it never occurred to me just how brilliant that scene is. And I realized too, I was like, it took me actually a few viewings before I started to realize how brilliant that monologue is. And I'm curious, Tony, as to what your thoughts were, if that was a standout moment for you, or what you thought about that.
Yeah, it was, because it does feel like it taps into the level of myth and mythology behind Jaws, and that's something that maybe isn't necessarily first apparent on first viewing or when people think about this film. But I really do think there is a richness to the world of this, and the idea that Quint is representing something deeper and more metaphysical. And I think that whole speech is really good, because it's like Brody and Hooper are listening to someone from a completely different world, a world of monsters and legend and, these terrible things that people don't realize happen. And I think a lot has to be said for Robert Shaw's performance in this as well, because I think he really does. I mean, the thing I remember him from more, that he's from Russia with Love, where he plays Red Grant, and he's this merciless sort of Russian assassin with a British accent, and he could not be further away from that character with Quint. He's this, salty sea dog with this American kind of the big sideburns, and but he really does have that feeling of get across that feeling of a character. He's almost like he could have lived hundreds of years, this guy. And he's just been sailing the seas for and defeating krakens and facing, and it's just, and when you first see him with that, like you say, that brilliant shot, and you see him put with these townsfolk, he is so far away from normality, that he stands out as a larger than life archetypal character. And I think that in that speech, that it was great that they got that in there, because it really allows that to shine through for me.
Yeah, and it's the same thing with I'm glad you brought Red Grant. I remember going back and watching From Russia with Love and realizing, as a fan of Jaws, like, wait a second, oh my God, that's Quint. Yeah. And that is, From Russia with Love is one of my favorite Bond movies, and that performance is one of my favorite. And it's often forgotten about, because Bond is known for its more outlandish scenarios and its more outlandish villains. Like in the following film, you had Oddjob. But someone like Red Grant, part of what makes him so effective is how efficient, cold, and low-key he is. Like that sequence on the train. How many times, well, Mr. Bond, I will now regale you with the tale of how I will defeat you. But like that moment on the train is that scene, but the way Robert Shaw plays it is very like, yes, well, I'm going to kill you now. And it's so much more effective. It's so much more effective. It's the same thing that he brings to the table with the Indianapolis, when he's just like, he's like, he doesn't look alive at all until he bites you. And it's just like the way he tells that story. He does such a good job. It's less is more. It's the same concept behind the film, behind the technique and the thought process of not showing the shark until the end. That same thought process of how much more terrifying just to listen to him talk. And if he had been like, and then it bit us, and da 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 da. It's the brilliance of Shaw as an actor to say, I'll just tell it low key, and it's more horrifying just to hear it matter of fact with an almost zero emotion coming from him.
And that again, I think is that blend of the two sort of contrasting styles that Spielberg is putting together here. Because while he is in essence a larger than life character, he is this this captain, this sea dog. At the same time, he is played on a low key level. He is played on with more of a down to earth edge, and it's fascinating because it in a way it almost feels like a contrast, too deep a contrast, but it actually fits. It fits when you put him in with these particularly sort of grounded characters like Hooper and particularly Brody, and they all just work off each other so well, and it really. I mean, I think Spielberg has said that when he read the book, because obviously this is based on the book by Peter Benchley, and one of the things he said was that he wanted to change plenty of like the stuff before the end. I mean, there's stuff in there apparently where I haven't read the book, but there's stuff like how Brody's wife has an affair with Hooper.
Yeah,
and I was like, how is that going to help them at the end when they're like trying to fight away? I suppose it's to build tension. So in that book, I'm sure that they're just pissed at each other. But at the same time,
it's like, do you need more tension? There's a shark trying to kill you. How much more?
And he wanted to pare it down. He wanted to get to the nub of what that was. And he said the bit that entertained me the most was the last 100-odd pages, which was them on the boat fighting the shark. And you can understand why he devotes almost half the movie to that in the end. Yeah. And I think but that wouldn't have worked if these characters didn't work as well off each other and were made more likable. That's the other thing he said, that they worked quite well to bring more humour to the table. And there are points I laughed out loud in this film, and I didn't expect that. Actually, that's something where you say, what was one of
your favorite laugh lines in the movie?
I think when Hooper's introduced, there's a couple of great points where he's talking to those guys who are trying to get off. They're all on a mat. They're on this tiny boat. There's a bunch of guys about to go out to try and get the shark, and he says something like, "Okay, you're going to be dead in like 5 minutes," or something like that.
He's like, they're all going to die.
You're all going to die. And then, when he walks into the office where Brody's, or just before that, Brody's like deputy is outside, and Brody throws some like stones at the window to get his attention, and the guy just looks through the window and waves.
Yes.
Just laughed out loud.
That's one of my favorite beats in the movie.
Like, get in here, And I just didn't expect those moments of like laugh out loud comedy, and it was really good.
That's what Spielberg's so good at, is mixing these tones. And you have, one of the low points of the film is when Mrs. Kittner comes up to Brody, slaps him in the face, and is like, "My son's dead." And it's this emotion, you just feel it so much. It's so good. And then what makes the movie brilliant and what makes Spielberg brilliant is he then follows it up with that dinner scene with Brody and his son, them just mimicking the son mimicking his movements. Yeah. And what a great, I mean, he just give us a kiss. Why? Because I need it. And that's it. And I love the what is, my husband has that fear of, what is it? Isn't there a term for, drowning. That's another one of my favorite lines in the movie.
Yeah, it's got that in there, which is to its credit, because I think, I always think with cinema, the best movies and the ones that have the most dramatic power, quite often the ones that manage to find humor at the same in certain ways, and they can, and this does this really well. Like you say, it can flip between the two. It can take you to a point where you're laughing and you're with the characters, and then suddenly, you get slapped in the face, whether it's literally in this case or with something that really grinds you and make and Spielberg is on his day one of the best for this, because he manages to get the right screenwriter. Spielberg is famously not a writer. He's never written anything. He's a director. Or he's contributed to scripts and things, but he's not a writer. But I
think the only thing he's written that he has sole credit for is Close Encounters.
I take that back. Then he has written that one.
Give him some credit. Give him some credit, Tony.
But that's it. It's not me having a go. It's more just the fact that he knows how to work with writers and how to employ good people.
Yeah, I think he'd agree with you that he's not like no. Writing is not my forte.
Yeah, but he knows how to bring it all together, and I think I know Peter Benchley wrote the screenplay for this, and he's got the credit, I think, but he did bring in other people to touch the dialogue up and do these kind of things, a bit like how in The Last Crusade, which I mentioned at the top of this podcast, he brings in Tom Stoppard to write a lot of the comedy between Indy and his dad, and it's brilliant, and it's just and he's got a great way of bringing those. And then those films are lighter anyway, so it's easier to do that. But to put that into Jaws, a film which, on paper is supposed to be this terrifying thrill ride, this horrific thrill ride, is great. And I think I liked these characters. And from what, he says and what other people have said, they're not as likable in the book. And I think that is the key to why this works in a big way.
Definitely. And I think, again, the changes from the book to the movie are really about efficiency and about there's a lot of fluff in the book. I haven't read it. I know people who have read it, some who like it and some who really don't. But the affair and just all this, all the backstories and things like that, it just feels like in terms of telling the story that needed to be told, it doesn't get much more efficient than the film version of Jaws. But one of the best changes is the ending itself, the way the shark dies. Because in the book, I think what happens is the shark, I don't know if they stab it or they get another barrel on it, and the shark just swims around and just gets dragged down to the bottom and it just drowns or something. Yeah. Or I don't know if that's possible for a shark to drown, but whatever happens, it just gets it's something really, really uneventful, and then it sank to the bottom and it died. And it's very, very boring. And Spielberg basically told the author, he goes, I don't like that. I need something bigger. Here's what I'm thinking.
I'm going to blow it up.
Yes, we blow it up. And Benchley apparently was like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. That's not a shark does not swallow an oxygen tank. It is not like, you couldn't shoot it and blow. Like, what are you talking about? And Spielberg was like, look, if I have my audience for 2 hours and I do that, they're going to be with me for this 30, it doesn't matter. He's like, I don't want them sitting in their chairs. I want them out of their seats, jumping out of their, just jumping up and down. I want the audience on their feet, and I want them to feel the power of this ending. And I love it. Every time it happens, I get this urge to cheer when it's smile, you son of a, it's the explosion and the editing. My God, it's so good.
That is exactly how I feel whenever the truck goes over the cliff in Jaws. That's exactly the same feeling. It's that feeling of yes,
Yep.
And I think that's why Spielberg is a showman, and I think he understands entertainment, and he understands how to, like you've just said, how to get audiences off their feet in a way that, with the greatest of respect to Peter Benchley, an author doesn't live in that kind of headspace. An author, that may well work in the book, I don't know, but I think you have to think in cinematic terms, and that's why quite often you have to make changes when you adapt material, because there is no way that described ending for for the shark would have been anywhere near as entertaining as what we got. You know, physics and logic be damned. It doesn't matter. This is ultimately like a fight against a big shark. Like, you know, audiences aren't going to sit in their chair and go, well, actually, logically and physically, he wouldn't have swallowed an oxygen tank. So who cares? Like, this, and that's the thing. That's why it works, definitely. And there's a euphoria at the end, in that man has conquered monster, which is a great feeling, definitely.
So we've talked a lot about the things we loved about the movie and the things that worked for us. Is there anything that didn't necessarily work for you as well?
I don't know. Genuinely nothing leaps to mind. I don't know if I'd say this is a perfect movie, but equally, I can't really think of anything. I mean, it maybe could have shaved off 10 minutes, perhaps. Some of the editing could have been a bit quicker. There could have been some parts of it cut, but I struggle to really necessarily think of specific scenes. So, do you know, I can't...
The only thing I can think of is the shark itself. Sometimes it definitely looks fake, but for the most part, they pull it off.
Yeah.
That's really, really digging. I mean, I'm at a loss to think of things. It's hard to tell. Like with you've seen it. This is the first time you've seen it. It's hard to make any. I've seen movies where I know it's a masterpiece where I'm just like, well, I don't know if I want to say that yet. But in Jaws' case, I would go out of my way and say, like, I think it is a perfect movie. I think it's an absolute masterpiece, and it's very, very hard to think of something that would take away from that in the film. That was one of the things. Again, it's a little over 2 hours, and to me, I'm just sitting there. I'm so into the movie that by the end of it, I'm like, oh my God, how much time has passed?
Yeah.
What is going on?
Yeah.
It's just so efficient in its storytelling that I honestly, it's a struggle for me too. Having seen it multiple times, I couldn't pick anything I don't like about it.
Well, that's great. You know, it's. I look forward to watching it again, definitely, because it will. I suspect it will feel even richer, you know, as time goes on, for sure. But yeah, I wouldn't want to just try and make something up for the sake of an answer, because I really just think it is extremely well done. You know, extremely well written, great performances. You know, I'm still staggered to learn as well that Roy Scheider ad-libbed the most famous line in the film. You know, we're going to need a bigger boat. You know, I can't believe that was an ad-lib. You know, it's things like that.
Isn't that incredible?
Amazing. You know, absolutely amazing. And so I think that it just feels like a bit of alchemy that it all came together in adversity, in the fact that it was difficult, that they couldn't get things working in the original way. And even, apparently, Richard Zanuck, one of the head producers of Universal, I think him or his co-producer said, I think, that if they'd read the book twice, they never would have filmed it, because they would have realised how hard it would have been to make.
Yes, exactly.
If that isn't a level of destiny and fate to this film, I don't know what is. You know, it all seemed to just traverse all of the usual, you know, problems that could have come of it. And it just, I think, cements just how much of a genuine genius Steven Spielberg is, and now I think he should, go down in history as probably the greatest director of possibly the last half of the 20th century. I think, you know, I find it, some people might dispute that, and they would say, you know, that Stanley Kubrick deserves that, or Martin Scorsese, and I think I would find it hard to argue against them in many ways, but I don't know if anyone has quite created such a consistent level of cinema to the skill and degree that he has so often in anyone's career.
Additionally, Kubrick, who is undoubtedly a master, same for Scorsese. I think with Spielberg you find a bit more variety. I know with Scorsese there are arguments to the contrary, and in both Kubrick and Scorsese's filmographies, but I don't know that you would find like a movie like Jaws with something like E.T., with a pure action movie like Raiders, with a film like Schindler's List, with something like Jurassic Park, a special effects driven. You know, he has such versatility and flexibility, and his ability to just embrace every genre and make the best movie of that genre.
Yeah.
I don't know. I find myself agreeing with you, even as I love Kubrick and Scorsese. I think it's very hard to think of somebody who is who makes it look so effortless, being able to kind of leap from one genre to another. But
he's not perfect, and not every one of his films is perfect by any means. He's made films that are not as good, and he'd admit that himself. He'd go, well, 1941 is no masterpiece, but I think I think that it is as the first film to really sort of establish his style. I think Jaws is pretty astonishing, and I don't know if there's any other filmmaker who's quite done that in quite the same way.
I agree, and I think that sums it up pretty perfectly. Is there anything else we want to bring up about Jaws, or what do you think? Final ratings?
Well, I suppose I'm curious to see the sequels. I'm curious to see. Wasn't the one that Michael Caine did because he wanted to buy a house?
Was he in one? Oh my God!
I'm sure there's a story about how he was in like Jaws 3 or 4.
Oh yeah, he was in Jaws 4. Wow.
He only did it because he wanted to buy a house in the Bahamas, and it paid for his house. That's the only reason he did it.
I hope he's happy. That better be a really great house. It better be one of the best houses.
Right, exactly. So maybe I'll watch the sequels just for that. Really.
Yeah, I think.
Go on. Sorry.
I think I might be watching them soon with my friend Brad, who I mentioned in the first part, and Aaron Prescott for a Between Takes episode of Missing Frames. I think we might go through the series. I haven't seen a single one of the sequels. I've been avoiding them because I just don't care. But I might have to do it.
I look forward to that.
Pray for me. Well, let's go ahead and say final ratings. We'll do for our scales. We'll say. What do you think? Fair Spanish ladies on a scale of 1 to 5. Farewell and adieu to you, fair Spanish ladies. We'll do. How many Spanish ladies would you give Jaws?
Oh, I think we've got to give it 5, haven't we? Really? I mean,
we do.
It's so.
I say that like it's like, oh yeah, I guess, but like no, of course.
Of course it is. I mean, there's no way it can really be anything less than that, because
here's the tougher question. Do you know where you'd rank it in Spielberg's filmography?
Well, I think that this is the difficult one, because I was thinking about this earlier. I don't know if it would, if I was ranking favourites, it wouldn't be in my top 5 probably, because I haven't got such a relationship with this film as I have with many of his others. So,
right.
But in terms of actual quality and skill, I think it is top 5. Yeah. I think I'd have to properly put it out there, but I and properly rank them. But it is a really skilled piece of work. So maybe 5, maybe number 5. I'd say maybe behind Jurassic Park, behind Schindler's List, behind Raiders, and possibly E.T. maybe,
E.T.,
but
okay.
I don't know.
I'm actually curious as to where I rank this, because I wanted to see if it still fits. But I went onto my Letterboxd, and my top 5 Spielberg are E.T., Raiders, Jaws, Schindler's List, and Jurassic Park. And I think I would still put. I think that's still accurate. I think that would still. I think E.T. and Raiders are my favorite. But I do agree with you. I think if I were to look at it from an objective standpoint, Jaws would be very close to number 1. It's it's about as perfect a cinematic expression as I think I've ever seen. So great.
Yeah,
this is
amazing.
Fantastic. Well, Tony, I'm glad you loved it. I'm glad I could be a part of this experience.
Well, thank you so much, because I would not have got here as quickly, I think, were it not for this podcast. Definitely, I'm sure I would have done it eventually, but it's so nice to have an excuse, and the more I think about it, quite honestly, I feel like I could probably be on every episode of this show for the rest of my life. The amount of films I haven't seen yet that I should have seen.
We will absolutely have you back. I think I could be on this show for every episode for the rest of my life. Not because I want to be, but because I have to be.
Right.
But yes,
exactly.
You have an open invitation. Please come back anytime. And speaking of podcasts, Tony, tell the people at home about the good work you're doing out there on the interwebs.
Well, we don't have another hour left, so I'll try and make this as quick as I can. I run a podcast network called We Made This, which is essentially a pop culture podcast network, but we cover things like TV, music, film, various other different things. And we've got a range of podcasts, ranging from talking about things like Star Trek to old movies to albums that are out and that kind of thing. So you can find that at the website is wemadeThisPod.com, because somebody annoyingly has claimed wemadeThis.com. Which, if I ever find those people, I'm going to feed them to a shark.
That's why I'm Yay Shawn Doorman on Twitter, because somebody apparently is Shawn Doorman. Who are you? Show yourself.
Yeah, where are you? Yeah, exactly. Like, it's so annoying. But yeah, so wemadeThisPod.com, and you can find us on Twitter at WeMadeThisPod, and we've got a Facebook page as well. So look us up for all the different podcasts we do, and if you want to find me particularly, I'm on Twitter quite often at AJBlackWriter. So it'd be lovely to speak to you and have a chat, and hope you check out all the shows we do.
Absolutely. And again, I'm at Yay Shawn Doorman on Twitter, at Shawn Doorman on Instagram. Let's hear from everybody, all the Spielberg fans. Where do you rank Jaws? What do you think of it? Is it a perfect film? Let's hear it. I want to hear all the opinions. Make sure you're tagging Tony as well.
Yeah,
and I think, I was going to say we need a bigger podcast. I don't know if that actually makes sense as the way to close it out. I don't think podcasts get much bigger than this, though. So I want to thank you again, Tony, and thank everyone for listening. We'll see you next time.